Okay, so that was a survey of the different types of protists, our 6 different supergroups. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ecology of protists. And the basic ecology is if there's water, there's probably a protist that lives there. Fresh water, salt water, doesn't matter. There are protists in wet environments worldwide. It also doesn't have to be a whole stream. It could just be, a pool. There are a lot of protists that are involved in mutualistic relationships. Mutualism is when both members are benefited. One example of that is that dinoflagellates live in a mutualism with coral. So in this example, the dinoflagellates, since they're photosynthetic, are able to provide energy molecules to the coral. The coral gives the dinoflagellate a place to live and protection. In fact, it's something like 90% of the energy that corals get comes from dinoflagellates. Now, this is pretty impressive, especially when you think about the fact that corals are, in fact, they're little animals, right? They're little animals that are capturing food particles themselves, but mainly they're relying on those dinoflagellates to provide their energy. Recently, there have been some concerns because warming water temperatures has caused a phenomenon known as coral bleaching. In coral bleaching, the dinoflagellates leave the coral. And so once those dinoflagellates are out of the coral, well, there goes 90% of the energy that the coral normally gets. And this can lead to the death of the coral. In this picture, the coral is still alive, but it's going to die if conditions don't improve. We also see a mutualism with termites. In termites, they eat wood. If you've ever tried, eating a chunk of paper or a piece of firewood, you've noticed it's not a great food item. That's because we can't digest cellulose, but it turns out that the protists that live in the digestive tracts of termites, they can digest cellulose. And so once again, the protists get a place to live, they get food provided for them, and the termites get a way of digesting cellulose. Another thing that we sometimes interact with protists as diseases. So there's a variety of diseases caused by protists. We already talked about malaria, we talked about sleeping sickness. Sudden oak death is another disease that's caused by protists. And so you can see the leaves turning brown. You see almost looks like bleeding coming from the trunk of the tree. This is another example of a disease caused by Phytophthora. Phytophthora causes a lot of plant diseases. Protists are also really important in doing photosynthesis. In fact, it's something like 1/4 of all the photosynthesis done on Earth is done by protists. Now, this really impresses me because when I think of photosynthesis, I think of, one, the Amazon basin, right? The Amazon, huge amount of plants, huge amount of photosynthesis. I also think of the boreal forest that stretches across Canada and across Europe and Asia. Huge number of these evergreen trees. Even though there are those huge numbers of plants in those places, still 1/4 of photosynthesis is done by protists. Why are protists able to do so much photosynthesis compared to plants when, holy cow, there's a lot of plants? Well, of course, the answer comes from the fact that the oceans are big places. In fact, on this map, most of the Pacific Ocean isn't even shown. There's a huge amount of area there. And so because protists are found in water, that means there get to be a lot of them. They're mostly single-celled, but when you have that huge amount of habitat, you have a huge amount of protists. So 1/4 of all photosynthesis is done by protists. About half of all photosynthesis is done by plants. Who does the other 1/4 then? We got 25% protists, 50% plants, means we got 25% left. Cyanobacteria, photosynthetic prokaryotes. All right, well that brings us then to plants. So we're going to move here from chapter 23 all the way up to chapter 25. I feel like the plant chapter makes more sense than our progression. So we're going to talk about more than one chapter about plants. We're going to start talking about plants here. Just to remind you, we're talking about plants. We're talking about archaeplastidans, right? closest relatives of the green algae. We can often refer to these as the land plants. The plants are a group that contains somewhere around 300,000-ish species. Most of these are seed plants. So we'll talk about the different types. Most plants produce seeds, and most plants produce flowers. So we have a picture here on the right. This ridiculously large flower. It's kind of a cool flower. That flower smells like death. The benefit of smelling like death is that flies are attracted to dead meat because that is where flies lay their eggs. By smelling like death, that flower attracts flies. The flies come into the flower, look around for dead meat, don't find any, but they pick up pollen, fly away, and when they smell death again, maybe they land in another flower of the same species, pollination has taken place. We're going to see a lot of different flowering plants. That one happens to be one of the bad smelling ones. All plants are multicellular. So you might hear people talk about single-celled plants. If they say that, they're referring to what we would call protists. Plants are found pretty much everywhere on land. The only real limitations have to do with if temperatures are way too cold or way too dry. They have really dry habitats. There are some plants that live in the water. So we think of those plants sort of secondarily invaded water. So they started out on land but have moved back to water. Lily pads, for example, duckweed is the picture on the right here. But if there's land and there's enough water to support it, there's probably a plant that lives there. Plants are incredibly important. The effects on the habitat are just almost immeasurable. I mean, just imagine any place that's not pure concrete and think about the plants that live there. I mean, even if it's just a lawn, that would be a very different place if it wasn't for the grass that's living there. If you think about a forest, that structure is all based on the plants. And so the plants provide habitat for lots and lots and lots and lots of other organisms. All very, very high impact species. Okay, so the closest relatives of plants are the green algae. And green algae, like most protists, live in water. So, why did plants move to land? We're going to start by thinking about the benefits of a move to land. Now, keep in mind, this isn't like an alga was floating around the water, was looking around and looked up on land and was like, hey, I'd like to go up there, right? We're talking about an evolutionary process. But there must have been benefits to select for that move to land over time. And one of the big benefits was that photosynthetic organisms need sunlight. And as we talked about before, water filters out some of those wavelengths of sunlight. If you go deep enough in the water, it filters out all the wavelengths of sunlight. Up on land, water's not getting in the way of that sunlight. And so more sunlight available for photosynthesis. Another important ingredient for photosynthesis, carbon dioxide. Lots of carbon dioxide available for those plants then to fix into sugar. There's also soil. Right? A lot of minerals, especially when you think about the plants were first moving up there, there would have been exposed minerals that were eroding away, providing the minerals that those plants needed to live. And initially, no herbivores, nothing to eat them, right? So potentially escaping enemies by escaping up to land. So these are all strong reasons why it would be beneficial for plants to move to land. However, there were some problems they had to overcome. One of the big problems was that algae live in the water. They have all the water they need all the time because that's where they live. Moving to dry land means having to deal with avoiding drying out. Additionally, in the water, you have that buoyancy to support you. On dry land, you have to support yourself, right? Think about my example. This is going to be an animal example, but it really makes sense here. Think about a jellyfish. You ever see a sea jelly that's up on the beach? It just looks like a blob, right? Because it doesn't have that structural support. It doesn't have that support of water once it's moved onto that land. Same thing with algae. Algae could just rely on the buoyancy of water to support it. On dry land, you have to have your own support. The last detriment issue to think of, the things that to deal with, is reproduction. In an aquatic environment, an individual can produce sperm and eggs, or sperm or eggs, and release them out of the water, and they could float around and eventually run into the other gamete. On land, you don't have that water to wash things around, and so if you just kind of throw gametes out there, they don't go anywhere. So they had to figure out how to get gametes from individual to individual. Now, as we talked about, land plants have the closest relatives of the charophyte green algae. And in fact, there's a couple of species of charophyte green algae that seem really similar to modern land plants and may be representative of what those first plants would have been like. On the left, we have one called Chara. On the right, we have one called Coleochaete. Both of these look pretty plant-like. Coleochaete looks like kind of like a lily pad, except it's just one cell thick. Chara looks kind of like, kind of a shrubby type of growth. Both of these are pretty similar to some current plants and, may have been what modern plants evolved from. Something similar to this, at least. All right, so what makes land plants different than everybody else? Right? Remember, synapomorphy, shared derived characteristics. Well, one thing that we find in all land plants is an alternation of generations life cycle. We talked about that in the last lecture. Alternation of generations life cycle, meiosis and fertilization alternating. More importantly, a multicellular gametophyte stage and a multicellular sporophyte stage. The zygote formed by that fertilization is going to grow into the sporophyte. The sporophyte produces spores by meiosis. Those spores grow by mitosis into the gametophyte. Gametophyte produces gametes by mitosis. And those gametes go through fertilization and produce the zygote. All right, so again, alternation of generations life cycle, really important for understanding what plants do. We're going to talk about it in great detail. Make sure you're familiar with it. Kind of can map it out. Can kind of trace what's happening, see where those landmark events of fertilization and meiosis take place. And don't forget, in order to be alternation of generations, we have to have a multicellular haploid and a multicellular diploid phase. Now, something special about land plants is that in their alternation of generations life cycle, they provide protection for the embryo. All right, well, where's the embryo in our life cycle here? All right, so let's take a look at the life cycle. The zygote is going to grow by mitosis into the sporophyte. The embryo are those first stages of growth. So after that zygote starts growing, it becomes multicellular here. That is where we're going to find that embryo. And in land plants, they're going to provide protection for that embryo. That embryo is going to have some covering over it. That embryo is going to be more likely to survive because it's being protected. In the green algae that the land plants are related to, that embryo does not get protection. It's just kind of off by itself. This is such an important change that some people have suggested we should actually refer to the land plants as the embryophytes. Right? Phyte meaning plant, embryo protection, the embryophytes. This is something that's pretty distinctive and is one of the reasons that plants have become so successful is because they protect their embryos.